11:30 p.m. Hamilton Grand Hotel lobby gleamed under crystal chandeliers, but the real drama was happening 20 feet above ground level. David Carter balanced on a stepladder, replacing burnt-out bulbs with the careful precision of someone who understood that even the smallest details mattered. His Navy uniform bore the simple name tag that marked him invisible to most guests. The lobby's marble floors reflected everything, except the truth about what was about to unfold. When Rebecca Hamilton swept through those doors, her Armani heels clicking against stone, her 6-year-old daughter trailing behind like a shadow, she had no idea she was looking at her daughter's future savior, the man she would soon fire without a second thought. David's weathered hands paused mid-motion as mother and daughter passed beneath him, and for just a moment, time seemed to tick differently in that space between floor and ceiling. The night shift at Hamilton Grand had become David Carter's sanctuary 3 months ago, when the bills started piling higher than his pride could handle. At 35, he moved through the hotel's corridors with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned that visibility often meant vulnerability. His work boots made no sound against the marble as he descended the ladder. These sounds had become his companions since his late wife's medical bills forced him to trade his engineering blueprints for a maintenance toolkit. Tommy waited at home in Queens, probably asleep with his math homework still spread across the kitchen table, trusting that Dad would check it before morning. David folded the stepladder with practiced movements, his calloused fingers avoiding the worn spots where metal had rubbed against metal for too many years. The lobby's opulence surrounded him like a museum he was hired to preserve, but never meant to truly inhabit. He understood their language of casual entitlement, had once spoken it himself in conference rooms that smelled of leather and ambition. But that was before grief taught him that some distances couldn't be measured in dollars or degrees. The hotel's night manager nodded from behind the mahogany desk, a gesture that acknowledged David's presence without requiring conversation. Rebecca Hamilton emerged from the executive elevator like a force of nature contained in a perfectly tailored gray suit. At 38, she carried herself with the kind of authority that came from inheriting both wealth and the weight of expectations. Her daughter Lily moved beside her with the careful steps of a child who had learned to match her behavior to boardroom schedules. The little girl's school backpack looked enormous against her small frame, and David noticed the way she clutched a worn teddy bear despite trying to appear grown up. Rebecca's phone buzzed constantly, each notification pulling her attention away from the child who had spent another evening in corporate offices instead of playgrounds. As their footsteps faded toward the parking garage, David found himself holding something small and brown. Lily's teddy bear had fallen from her tired grip, landing silently on the marble floor. The stuffed animal was clearly beloved, its fur worn smooth in places where small hands had sought comfort. David looked toward the closing elevator doors, then at the bear in his palm. Some decisions required no thought at all. He pressed the elevator call button, watching the numbers climb to 15, then descend again. When the doors opened, Rebecca stood alone, her expression shifting from impatience to confusion as she saw the maintenance man holding her daughter's most precious possession. "She dropped this," David said simply, extending the bear toward Rebecca. His voice carried the quiet strength of someone who understood that small kindnesses often mattered most. Rebecca's manicured fingers brushed against his work-roughened ones as she took the toy, and for an instant the space between their worlds felt smaller than the distance between floors. "Thank you," she said, and something in her tone suggested she meant more than just the returned bear. The elevator doors began to close again, but not before David glimpsed Lily's sleeping face against her mother's shoulder, one small hand already reaching for the familiar comfort of her lost friend. The silence that followed felt heavy with possibilities neither of them were ready to explore. Several weeks passed before their paths crossed again, but the hotel's rhythm had subtly changed. David found himself assigned to more repairs on the executive floors. The 15th floor became familiar territory during his late-night maintenance calls, where David often saw Rebecca hunched over spreadsheets while Lily curled on the leather sofa, small shoulders rising and falling with exhausted sleep. One Thursday evening, David arrived to repair a malfunctioning air conditioning unit and found Lily awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor with crayons scattered around her like fallen leaves. She was drawing what looked like houses, but each structure stood alone on the paper, isolated and somehow hollow despite their bright colors. The little girl looked up when David entered, her eyes holding the kind of old soul wisdom that came from spending too many evenings in adult spaces. "Mom's on a conference call," she whispered, pointing toward the closed inner office where Rebecca's voice rose and fell in corporate negotiations. David nodded and began unpacking his tools, working with deliberate quiet. But when he glanced back at Lily's drawings, something twisted in his chest. Houses without doors, families without faces, spaces that looked beautiful but felt empty. Without saying a word, David disappeared into the hallway and returned with a warm cup of milk from the executive kitchen, along with 2 chocolate chip cookies wrapped in a hotel napkin. He placed them beside Lily's artwork, with the same care he might use to handle delicate machinery. The little girl looked up at him with surprise, as if kindness from strangers was unexpected enough to be remarkable. "Thank you," she said in the formal way children spoke when they'd been coached to be polite to adults. David simply nodded and returned to his work. But he noticed how Lily's drawings began to include doors after that, small rectangular spaces that suggested the possibility of entering or leaving at will. When Rebecca emerged from her call an hour later, she found her daughter asleep on the sofa with crumbs on her fingers and a smile on her face. The next Saturday, David brought Tommy to the hotel to retrieve some tools he'd left behind. At 8 years old, Tommy possessed his father's quiet curiosity, but expressed it with the boundless energy of childhood. They were examining the lobby's architectural features when Lily appeared with Rebecca, both dressed casually for what looked like a shopping expedition. The 2 children regarded each other with the careful assessment of potential allies, while the adults exchanged polite nods that carried undertones of recognition. "Tommy, this is Lily," David said, his voice gentle but encouraging. "Lily, this is my son." The children's introduction unfolded with the miraculous simplicity of childhood. Within minutes, they were sitting on the lobby's marble floor, building an elaborate structure with Tommy's collection of small cars and Lily's hair ties. Their laughter echoed off the high ceilings, transforming the formal space into something warmer, more alive. Rebecca found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in weeks, as she watched her daughter engage with genuine joy instead of polite compliance. "They seem to understand something we don't," she said quietly, settling onto a nearby bench as David joined her. "Children see what's there instead of what should be there," David replied, watching as Tommy showed Lily how to balance a toy car on top of their improvised tower. His words carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned through loss and adaptation. Rebecca studied his profile, the strong jawline softened by laugh lines, the careful way he observed his son's interactions, the gentle authority in his voice when he spoke about things that mattered. "You sound like you know something about rebuilding," she said, and there was no corporate edge to her voice now, just curiosity and perhaps the beginning of trust. When Tommy asked loudly why Lily lived in a hotel instead of a house, the question landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Rebecca's cheeks colored slightly, but David's gentle chuckle diffused the awkwardness. "Sometimes the best homes are wherever your family is," he told his son, then looked at Rebecca with understanding rather than judgment. "Besides, this is a pretty nice place to call home." As the afternoon stretched toward evening, David and Rebecca found themselves in genuine conversation for the first time. She asked about his philosophy of parenting, genuinely curious about how he balanced work responsibilities with single parenthood. "I learned early that children need presence more than presents," David said, watching Tommy help Lily arrange their toy city in more elaborate configurations. "They can sense when you're really there versus when you're just physically there." The comment wasn't meant as criticism, but Rebecca felt its truth nonetheless. "The hardest part is forgiving yourself for all the times you weren't," David said quietly. "But kids are remarkably resilient. They just want to know they matter more than everything else." When Tommy announced that he and Lily had decided to be building partners, both parents found themselves laughing with genuine delight. In the days that followed, David found himself noticing details about the building that his engineering mind couldn't ignore. The electrical system on the 14th floor had been showing irregularities for weeks, small fluctuations in power that suggested deeper problems brewing beneath the surface. He'd mentioned it to his supervisor twice, but budget constraints meant that preventive maintenance often took a back seat to crisis management. During his nightly rounds, David began carrying his personal tablet, loaded with diagnostic software that let him analyze the building's systems with the thoroughness his training demanded. The Hamilton Grand had been one of his early projects when he'd worked as a consulting engineer, back when his name had been on blueprints instead of uniform shirts. Late one evening, while checking the HVAC system on the 15th floor, David discovered Lily's latest artwork scattered across her mother's coffee table. The little girl had progressed from drawing isolated houses to creating elaborate family scenes. Stick figures standing together under rainbow skies, holding hands in front of houses that now had doors, windows, and even small details like flowers in window boxes. One drawing showed a tall man and a shorter woman standing with two children. All four figures surrounded by what looked like a hotel but felt like home. David studied the drawing for a long moment, recognizing something in the child's imagination that the adults hadn't yet allowed themselves to consider. When Rebecca emerged from her office, she found him standing very still, her daughter's artwork in his hands. "She's been drawing a lot lately," Rebecca said softly, moving to stand beside him. "I think she's trying to figure something out." David carefully placed the drawing back on the table, but not before Rebecca noticed the gentle way he handled her daughter's work, as if it were something precious rather than just childhood scribbles. "She's figuring out what family looks like," David said, his voice carrying both insight and caution. "Sometimes children see possibilities before adults are ready to admit they exist." "David," Rebecca said, and his name felt different in her mouth now, less formal, more personal. "I've been watching you work, and I have to ask, you're not just a maintenance worker, are you?" The question came out more directly than she'd intended, but something about the way he analyzed building schematics on his tablet, the technical precision of his repairs, the deep understanding he demonstrated of complex systems had been nagging at her for weeks. David's hands stilled on his toolkit, and for a moment, the only sound was the building's mechanical heartbeat around them. "I'm exactly what you need me to be," he said finally, but there was something in his voice that suggested layers of truth she hadn't uncovered yet. Rebecca felt a familiar frustration, the same feeling she got when crucial information was being withheld in business negotiations. But this time it was mixed with something else, something that felt dangerously like trust. The moment stretched between them, full of questions that neither was ready to ask or answer. David's pocket watch ticked steadily against his chest, marking seconds that felt heavy with possibility. 2 weeks later, the building's electrical system finally reached its breaking point. David had been tracking the deteriorating conditions for days, documenting voltage fluctuations and system irregularities that painted a clear picture of impending failure. His reports to management had been filed but not acted upon, Preventive maintenance was expensive, and the quarterly budget had already been allocated to more visible improvements. At 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything, the inevitable happened. Sparks from an overloaded circuit on the 14th floor ignited insulation that had been deteriorating for months. The building's fire suppression system failed in precisely the way David had predicted. Sprinklers on the 14th floor never activated due to corroded sensors that hadn't been replaced despite his recommendations. David, making his routine rounds on the 12th floor, smelled the smoke before any alarm sounded. His engineering training kicked in immediately, not the reflexes of a maintenance worker, but the systematic analysis of a man who understood building systems at their most fundamental level. He didn't run toward the nearest exit like evacuation protocols demanded. Instead, he ran toward the problem, because he knew something that no one else in the building knew. Rebecca and Lily were still in the 15th floor office. The VIP elevator, trapped between floors 14 and 15, had automatically shut down when smoke entered its shaft, a safety feature that had become a deadly flaw in this specific emergency. Through the building's security monitors, David could see the elevator car suspended in darkness, and his heart nearly stopped when he realized what that meant. Lily was inside, alone and terrified, while smoke began seeping through the shaft's ventilation gaps. David's mind raced through possibilities. The fire department was still minutes away, the building's internal emergency systems were compromised, and traditional rescue methods would take too long. Without hesitation, David abandoned every safety protocol he'd ever learned and did something that would have been impossible for anyone without his specific knowledge and experience. He accessed the building's original construction drawings on his tablet, locating the maintenance shaft that ran parallel to the elevator system. A space so narrow and dangerous that it was meant only for specialized equipment installation, never human passage. The shaft connected to the elevator at the precise point where Lily was trapped, but reaching it would require crawling through a space barely wider than his shoulders, navigating past electrical conduits and ventilation ducts, while smoke filled his lungs and heat seared his skin. The maintenance shaft was a nightmare of sharp edges and scorching metal, but David moved through it with the determination of a man who understood that some moments define everything that comes after. His pocket watch, the one memento he'd kept from his father, caught on a protruding bolt and fell away into the darkness below, its steady ticking silenced after decades of faithful service. But David didn't stop, didn't look back, because ahead of him he could hear Lily's frightened whimpers echoing through the shaft walls. When he finally reached the elevator access panel, his hands were torn and bleeding, his uniform blackened with soot, but his mind was crystal clear. Using tools and techniques from his engineering days, he manually overrode the elevator's safety systems and forced the doors open. Lily looked up at him with huge, tear-filled eyes, and in that moment, David saw not just a frightened child, but the embodiment of every reason he'd ever had for choosing love over ambition, presence over prestige. Carrying Lily through that maintenance shaft was the longest journey of David's life, every inch a battle against physics and fear, and the growing certainty that they might not make it out alive. But somehow they did. When David finally emerged from the building's bowels, Lily safe in his arms, the fire department was just arriving. Rebecca, who had been evacuated through the stairwell, saw them from across the street and ran toward them with a desperation that transcended her usual composed control. The security cameras, positioned at odd angles and partially obscured by smoke, captured only fragmented images of the rescue, enough to show that someone had saved her daughter, but not enough to clearly identify who. In the chaos of emergency response and media coverage, David slipped away like the invisible man he'd trained himself to be, leaving behind only questions and a pocket watch, ticking forgotten in the dark. The next morning, Rebecca stood in her smoke-damaged office, staring at the preliminary incident reports and trying to make sense of what had happened. The hotel's insurance company was already asking pointed questions about deferred maintenance and ignored safety recommendations. Rebecca's board of directors, facing potential lawsuits and regulatory scrutiny, demanded immediate action to demonstrate corporate responsibility. Someone had to be held accountable, and in the mathematics of crisis management, accountability usually flowed downward until it found someone expendable enough to absorb the blame. David returned to work that evening, as if nothing had happened, his torn uniform replaced, his burns hidden beneath long sleeves, his expression as professionally neutral as always. But Rebecca noticed everything now. The way he moved with slight stiffness that suggested recent injury, the careful way he held his left hand, the shadows under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. The staff meeting that sealed David's fate was supposed to be about implementing new safety protocols. But the board's agenda was different, focused on liability management and public relations. When David stood up during the open discussion period and quietly pointed out that the safety recommendations in his reports could have prevented the fire entirely, the room fell silent. "You're a maintenance worker, not a safety engineer," Rebecca heard herself saying, the words emerging from some corporate survival instinct she didn't recognize. "Your job is to fix problems, not to lecture management about policies you don't understand." The moment the words left her mouth, she wanted to take them back, but the damage was already done. David's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes dimmed, like a light being carefully extinguished. "Effective immediately. Your employment with Hamilton Grand is terminated for insubordination and failure to follow proper chain of command protocols." David gathered his tools with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else, his movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the humiliation of being fired in front of his colleagues. He didn't argue or protest or demand explanations. He simply nodded once, as if he'd expected this outcome all along. "I hope someday you'll understand that the people who care most about your daughter's safety aren't always the ones with corner offices," he said softly, his words directed at Rebecca, but spoken loud enough for the room to hear. Then he walked out of the conference room, out of the hotel, and out of the carefully controlled world that Rebecca had built around herself and her daughter. That evening, Lily asked why Uncle David hadn't come to say goodnight, and Rebecca found herself unable to answer. How could she explain that she'd fired the man who brought warm milk and cookies, who treated her daughter's artwork like treasures? Who understood that small kindnesses mattered more than grand gestures? Instead, she distracted Lily with promises of shopping trips and new toys, the kind of material substitutes that money could buy, but hearts couldn't accept. That night, Rebecca sat alone in her pristine office, surrounded by the trappings of success, and felt more isolated than she had ever felt in her life. Days passed with agonizing slowness, each one carrying Rebecca further from the truth and deeper into regret. She threw herself into work with desperate intensity, managing the fire's aftermath with the efficiency that had built her reputation. The Hamilton Grand would reopen stronger and safer than before, a corporate phoenix rising from the ashes of near disaster. But success felt hollow when measured against the cost of achieving it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: the hotel's IT department, responding to Rebecca's request for a complete review of the security footage from the night of the fire. The original images had been too obscured by smoke and darkness to provide clear identification of Lily's rescuer, but advanced digital enhancement revealed details that changed everything. Frame by frame, the enhanced footage showed a man in maintenance coveralls entering the building's service areas with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. It showed him accessing maintenance shafts that shouldn't have been navigable, moving through the building's infrastructure with the precision of an architect or engineer. Most importantly, it showed him emerging from impossible spaces with Lily in his arms, his face finally clear enough to identify beyond any doubt. Rebecca stared at the enhanced images on her computer screen, her hands shaking as the truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. With growing urgency, Rebecca accessed the hotel's employment records, searching for information that should have been reviewed long ago. What she found in David's personnel file changed everything she thought she knew about the man she had fired. David Carter, the file revealed, held a master's degree in structural engineering from Columbia University. He had worked for Hamilton Construction, her father's company, as a lead engineer for 3 years before abruptly resigning with no forwarding address. The dates aligned with personal tragedy: his wife's death, his son's need for stability, his choice to prioritize parenthood over career advancement. Rebecca realized with growing horror that she had fired not just an employee, but the very person who had designed the safety systems that should have prevented the fire in the first place. With trembling fingers, Rebecca pulled up the building's original construction documents. There, on blueprints dated 10 years earlier, she found David Carter's signature on engineering certifications and safety specifications. The maintenance shaft he had used to reach Lily wasn't just something he had discovered. It was something he had designed. The shame that washed over Rebecca was unlike anything she had ever experienced in her corporate life. She had failed not just as a CEO, but as a mother, as a human being, as someone who claimed to value integrity and fairness. The man who had risked his life to save Lily had been sitting across from her in staff meetings for months, offering expertise that could have prevented the crisis entirely, and she had been too blinded by class assumptions and corporate hierarchy to see him clearly. Now he was gone, fired for telling the truth, and Rebecca had no idea how to undo the damage she had caused. That evening, Rebecca did something she hadn't done in years. She left work early and drove to Queens. David's address was in his personnel file, a small apartment in a neighborhood that spoke of working-class dignity and careful financial management. The man who answered the door looked tired but unsurprised, as if he had been expecting this visit. David Carter stood in his doorway wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that made him look younger and more approachable than his maintenance uniform ever had. Behind him, Rebecca could see Tommy doing homework at a kitchen table, surrounded by the kind of cheerful clutter that spoke of a home where people actually lived. "I know who you are," Rebecca said, the words tumbling out before she could organize them properly. "I know what you did, and I know what I did, and I don't know how to fix it." David studied her face for a long moment, taking in the expensive clothes and careful makeup that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion and regret in her eyes. "Tommy," he called over his shoulder, "why don't you go work on your math in your room for a while?" The boy gathered his books without argument, and Rebecca noticed the trust in that simple exchange. David stepped aside to let her enter, and Rebecca found herself in a space that was small but warm, filled with evidence of a life lived with intention and care. Tommy's artwork covered one wall, displayed with the same pride that Rebecca had seen David show for Lily's drawings. Family photos showed a younger David with a woman who must have been his wife, both of them laughing with the kind of joy that seemed to come from shared secrets and simple pleasures. "I found the footage," Rebecca said, sitting on the edge of the couch that David indicated. "I saw what you did. I saw how you saved her. I also found your employment records. Your real employment records. I know you designed the building's safety systems. I know you tried to warn us about the problems." Rebecca's voice cracked slightly on the last words, the weight of her choices finally breaking through her professional composure. "I fired the man who saved my daughter's life, and I did it because I was too proud and too scared and too concerned about corporate liability to see the truth that was right in front of me." David sat down across from her, his movements careful and deliberate. You did what you thought you had to do, he said softly, and there was no sarcasm or bitterness in his voice. Don't make excuses for me. What I did was wrong, and we both know it. I chose my career over what was right. I chose protecting the company over protecting the person who protected my daughter. The silence that followed was heavy with truth and possibility. I don't know how to apologize for something this big, she said finally. I don't know how to make it right. David leaned forward slightly, his expression softening. You start by telling the truth, David said. To yourself, to your daughter, to the people who work for you. You start by admitting that you made a mistake and figuring out how to do better next time. I want to offer you your job back, she said, but David was already shaking his head. I don't work for people who don't trust me, he said simply. I can't go back to being invisible, to having my expertise ignored, to watching problems develop that could hurt people just because addressing them might be inconvenient or expensive. Rebecca felt panic rise in her chest. Then what do you want? She asked. How can I make this right? David was quiet for a long moment. I want you to promote safety over profits, he said finally. I want you to listen to your employees when they try to warn you about problems. And I want you to think about what kind of mother you want to be, David continued, his voice gentle but unflinching. Because Lily deserves someone who sees her as more than a scheduling conflict, someone who values presence over productivity. Rebecca felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from relief at finally hearing someone speak the truths she had been avoiding. I don't know how to be different, she admitted. I've been focused on success for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like to just be. David reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and silver. His father's pocket watch, somehow recovered from the building's wreckage and returned to working condition. This belonged to my dad, he said, holding it gently in his palm. It stopped working when my wife died, and I kept carrying it anyway because I couldn't let go of the time we'd had together. But recently it started working again. I think sometimes we need to break down completely before we can start keeping time again. He offered the watch to Rebecca, its steady ticking audible in the quiet room. Time isn't about how much you have, it's about what you do with what you've got. The conversation that followed was unlike any Rebecca had ever had. Honest, difficult, and ultimately healing in ways she hadn't expected. David didn't make her apologies easy or her path forward simple, but he offered something more valuable than forgiveness. He offered the possibility of transformation. When Rebecca finally prepared to leave, the pocket watch still ticking steadily in her palm, she felt different, lighter somehow, as if she had been carrying weight she hadn't realized was there. Will you consider coming back? She asked one last time. Not as a maintenance worker, but as director of building safety. David considered this for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. I'll think about it, he said finally. But if I come back, it has to be different. No more invisible men doing invisible work while the people in charge ignore what they're trying to say. Rebecca nodded, understanding that she was being offered a second chance that she didn't deserve, but would spend the rest of her career trying to earn. 6 months later, the Hamilton Grand reopened with safety systems that exceeded industry standards and a management philosophy that prioritized employee input and guest welfare over quarterly profit margins. David Carter, now director of building safety for the Hamilton hotel chain, had implemented comprehensive training programs and preventive maintenance protocols that became models for other luxury properties. Rebecca Hamilton had begun the difficult work of becoming the kind of leader and mother she wanted to be, rather than the kind she thought she had to be. The morning routine at Hamilton Grand had settled into something that felt like family rhythm rather than corporate scheduling. David arrived early to review overnight reports, his presence a calming influence that rippled through the hotel's operations. Rebecca and Lily came down for breakfast, but not before stopping by David's office to say good morning. Tommy often joined them on weekends, his friendship with Lily having evolved into the kind of easy companionship that made adults remember what uncomplicated affection looked like. The four of them moved through their shared spaces with comfortable familiarity, not as a traditional family, but as something equally valuable. People who had chosen to care for each other. On this particular morning, David sat at his desk reviewing architectural plans, his coffee cooling beside blueprints that bore his signature as both engineer and protector. Tommy perched on a chair beside him, asking questions about emergency evacuation routes with boundless curiosity. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor, her latest artwork spread around her like a colorful carpet. Her drawings had evolved from isolated houses to elaborate community scenes, neighborhoods where different kinds of families lived side by side, buildings connected by bridges and gardens, spaces designed for both privacy and connection. Rebecca paused in the doorway, watching this scene unfold with the kind of contentment she had never expected to find. The sight of her daughter drawing on David's office floor while his son asked engineering questions might have seemed chaotic to her former self, but now it looked like exactly what it was: life being lived with intention and joy. "Good morning, everyone," she said, settling into the chair across from David's desk with easy familiarity. David smiled at Rebecca across the children's chatter, and something passed between them that didn't need words: recognition, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction of people who had chosen to see each other clearly despite the obstacles that had initially stood in their way. The pocket watch in David's vest pocket ticked steadily, marking time that felt neither rushed nor wasted, but perfectly calibrated to the rhythm of lives lived with purpose. Rebecca gathered Lily's artwork carefully, treating each drawing with the same respect she would show to important business documents. These pictures would join the collection on her office walls, reminders of what success actually looked like when measured in terms of security and happiness rather than quarterly reports and market share. As they moved together toward the dining room, their footsteps echoing through marble hallways that had witnessed transformation, forgiveness, and the persistent human capacity for second chances. The morning light streaming through the Hamilton Grand's windows caught dust motes dancing in golden columns, each speck visible and beautiful in its momentary illumination. David paused to adjust a window's positioning, ensuring optimal natural light while maintaining temperature control, the kind of small attention to detail that made spaces more comfortable for everyone who inhabited them. The breakfast conversation flowed easily between practical concerns and playful speculation, work updates and weekend plans, the kind of multi-generational discussion that happened when adults remembered to include children as full participants rather than passive observers. When breakfast ended and the practical demands of the day began calling for attention, the transition felt natural rather than jarring. Rebecca kissed Lily goodbye with the kind of lingering affection that suggested she would genuinely miss her daughter during their separation. David walked them to the elevator, his hand resting briefly on Rebecca's shoulder in a gesture that acknowledged their partnership in ways that went beyond professional collaboration. The elevator carried Rebecca and Lily upward toward the executive floors, but the separation no longer felt like movement between different worlds. The day unfolded with the kind of productive rhythm that came from systems designed to serve human needs rather than forcing humans to serve systemic demands. Rebecca's leadership style had evolved from command and control to collaborative engagement, her decisions informed by input from employees who no longer feared retribution for sharing unwelcome information. David's safety protocols were implemented not as bureaucratic requirements, but as practical wisdom that protected everyone who lived and worked in Hamilton properties. The hotel's operations reflected this new philosophy. Guest satisfaction improved when staff members felt valued and heard. As afternoon sunlight slanted through Rebecca's office windows, she found herself looking forward to the end of the workday with anticipation rather than exhaustion. The park outing that had been planned that morning represented more than recreation. It was evidence of a life structured around relationship and joy rather than obligation and endurance. The four of them walked out of the Hamilton Grand together, moving from the elegant formality of marble and crystal into the democratic chaos of city streets where different kinds of success were measured by different standards. The park that afternoon was filled with families of every possible configuration. David and Rebecca found themselves part of this larger community, not as CEO and employee, but as two adults who had learned to prioritize what actually mattered over what they had been taught should matter. Tommy's kite soared against the autumn sky, while Lily fed ducks with serious concentration. The adults sat on a bench nearby, watching their children with the kind of relaxed attention that came from knowing they had time to be present, time to notice small moments, time to appreciate the ordinary miracles of childhood and friendship and second chances. As the sun began to set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the small group prepared to head home. But home now meant something different than it had 6 months earlier. Not just physical spaces where they slept and ate, but a sense of belonging that they carried with them wherever they went. Tommy and Lily chatted about their day's adventures, already planning future expeditions, their friendship a bridge between families that had chosen to become something larger and more resilient than the sum of their individual parts. The Hamilton Grand rose before them as they returned, its windows glowing with warm light that suggested welcome rather than work, home rather than just accommodation. The building that had once been the site of near tragedy had been transformed into something stronger and safer, not just structurally, but culturally. A place where people were seen and valued, where expertise was respected regardless of its source, where the most important kind of success was measured by the well-being of everyone who passed through its doors. The evening routine that had evolved over the months felt natural and unremarkable in the way that true contentment often did. Dinner shared between friends, homework completed with patient assistance, bedtime stories read with voices that conveyed security and affection. Rebecca tucked Lily into bed in their penthouse, the little girl's room now decorated with artwork that depicted not lonely houses, but thriving communities. David helped Tommy with his evening prayers in their Queen's apartment, the boys' gratitude including thanks for new friendships and adventures. The pocket watch on David's nightstand continued its faithful ticking through the night, keeping time for lives that had learned to honor both progress and presence, both aspiration and contentment, both the drive to build something better and the wisdom to appreciate what already existed. Time moved forward as it always did, carrying them toward tomorrow's possibilities, but it no longer felt like something to be conquered or optimized or escaped. Instead, it felt like what it had always been, the medium in which love could grow, connection could deepen, and ordinary people could discover that they were capable of extraordinary grace when they chose to see beyond the surface of things to the truth that lay waiting underneath.